Marianne, can you hear us? Ranin, Saja, Ilana, whoever, if you can hear us, please raise your hand.
Hello, everybody again. It's good to meet again, but as you know, this is our last meeting. So we decided to do something special this time, and we're going to read poetry together. I hope you'll enjoy it. We are going to practice various thinking routines that can be used while reading poetry with the students. And I will also try to remind you of the different techniques and the other thinking routines that we've used so far. It will also help you with the rubrics that you need to see, and maybe Yair, you should show them the rubrics. If you saw yesterday, Sandy asked me to explain to you what these rubrics are. So your coordinators will come and observe your lessons, and they will assess your lessons according to the rubrics that you can see here on the screen. There are 7 rubrics. We will talk about it while working. I will remind you, like beginning with a thought-provoking element, working with a well-structured lesson plan, working with the entire class. I will talk about it while working, and towards the end of the session, if you still have questions about those rubrics, you will have a chance to ask your questions, and we will try to explain it again so that you'll know what is expected from you when you prepare your lesson plans. Okay, so let's go back to our lesson about poetry. All right, why teach poetry? You may ask, why teach poetry and how is it connected to our program Thinking English? There are many, many good reasons why we should teach poetry. Poetry is considered the highest form of literature, and as such, it offers many opportunities to achieve goals that we set in the past and that cannot be achieved or are hard to achieve with other texts. Obviously, poetry is more attractive for students because it's short. The brevity is its strength, especially today with the short attention spans, when people send text messages, right, use emojis instead of words, and so on. So they find it hard to concentrate with longer text, and poetry is short and more easy to connect to. Poetry teaches and develops students' language awareness. Poets, when they write poetry, condense language to expand meaning, and they use various literary techniques to make their words more powerful than they naturally are. And we will talk about it while we discuss different poems, and you'll see what I mean. But we want our students to be more sensitive to the way language is used, and to know when advertisers and politicians and teachers and preachers and journalists use language, to be sensitive to the use of to the way language is used. We also want them to be very careful about the way they use language. If you remember last year when we started our in-service course, I said that one of our goals was to make them strive for accuracy and precision. Whenever we ask you to write a task, we limit the number of words because we want you to consider carefully each and every word that you use, to clarify your ideas first to yourselves and then to make them clear for the reader. So when they read poetry, they become more sensitive to the way words can be used. The most important reason why we should teach poetry is because it develops the students' open-mindedness. When poets write poetry, they use words, but they use them not only literally, they use words in such a way with all those literary devices, and they, in this way, reach our inner world. They help us make connections with our inner world, with our, they activate our senses in a way that other texts cannot do. And when students share their interpretations, they realize that different people understand the poem differently, depending on their own set of associations and the connotations that the poet triggered. So they learn to be more receptive and more open to other people's opinions, other people's interpretations, and to appreciate the value of collaborative thinking. And that's why teaching poetry is so important. It's something that does not happen with other texts in the same way. I would like to show them the quote of Wordsworth, the next one. William Wordsworth said that poetry is the first and the last of all knowledge. It is as immortal as the heart of man. And in the course of today's session, you will understand what he means. Don't worry, we are not going to read poems by Wordsworth, nor by William Shakespeare, or not even Robert Frost. We are going to read very simple poems, but you will see that even in these simple poems, there is so much that you can do with your students. So let's start, and we're going to begin with sharing of ideas, right? So we want to ask you to think about a lesson that you taught poetry in, a poem that you taught. Try to remember how you opened your lesson. What was your first task? And then openly, here, click on the link and write down the name of the poem and the first task that you used. If you don't remember, if you haven't taught a poem recently, you can just think of a poem that you know and that you wish you'd teach, and then think about the opening task and write it down. Is there someone who doesn't understand the task? If you don't understand, raise your hand.
Okay, and I'm also I also paste the link here in the chat box, so it's more convenient to open. If anyone needs a reminder on how to operate this Linoit app, please raise your hand. if someone didn't finish yet, please raise your hand in this app so we can know we need to wait a bit.
No? All right, so let's go back to the board and see the different ideas. Can you show them the... Can you please show them all the tasks at the same time? Okay, what we want to ask you to do now is, like always when students answer questions or put their ideas on the wall, we want to make sure that the others understand what they did or they wrote. So if you have a question about one of these ideas, please raise your hand and ask your question in the chat box. I think it will be easier, right? Okay, so if you don't understand something, raise your hand and then write a question in the chat box.
No, actually, it's better if you have a microphone, so please use it, because it's easier for us to communicate that way. If you don't have a mic, so use the chat box.
See one of these ideas, you can move it, you can drag it, click on it and move.
No, we cannot drag it. No. You can
what
bring
can
it to the up front.
Ah, okay, all right.
And Madeleine, I didn't understand.
The question is, if there is something that you don't understand in all these ideas that you see on the board, you may ask a question now. Iman can't hear me. Okay, I'll try to say it again, and maybe I shall summarize everything that we have done so far. Can you hear me now, Iman? Is it only me, Iman? So he doesn't hear me. Me too. They can't hear me.
Who hear us? Who can hear us now? Let's check. If you can hear me, please raise your hand, because it seems we have a problem here.
They do hear.
Okay, and Iman, is it better now? Not clear. And everybody else hear us clearly?
Madeleine also says that it's not clear. Madeleine and Iman.
Okay, let's see if everybody else can hear us clearly. So it might be something with your own connection. Okay, so maybe we wait. You can see if it changes in a few seconds.
To say a few things about the opening activity. I know that I've said it many times before, but it's always good to remember that when we plan a lesson, the first activity is very, very important. It sets the mood of the lesson. And we want, for the first activity, always to give all the students a chance to get seated, to calm down, and to think about the task. And we want them to think by themselves. So the first task is always individual. We want them to, we give them a task, we make sure that they understand the task, and then we ask them to think about it for themselves and to write down the answer. And we insist that they keep quiet while they're working so that everybody can think and concentrate without interruption. So the jump starter is very important. You will see it in the rubrics as well, that when your coordinators come to observe your lesson, they will examine your lesson and see that you've had a very good opening task. So is it now better, Iman and Madeleine? Can you hear me? I don't know. Okay. When the students write their answers, we always make sure that the others understand, and we ask them, are there any questions? If they have questions, we give them an opportunity to ask their questions and clarify, and let the owner of the answer clarify the answer. You have all these beautiful ideas on the screen, and you will get a recording of the lesson, so you will have a chance to see it again maybe after the lesson and use these ideas. As we said, we want to encourage collaborative thinking and to share ideas and to encourage our students to do that. So this is an example of collaborative thinking. Let's move to the first poem, right? Yeah, can you? Iman said it's better. No, and for Madeleine it's not clear. Okay, so this is the first poem that we are going to read today. As you see, it doesn't have a title, nor do we know who the poet is. It doesn't have capital letters, and it doesn't have punctuation marks. So your task is to click on the link and then write capital letters and add punctuation marks. This is the task. If it's not clear, first of all, click on the link, move to the task.
Put it in the chat box.
It's also in the chat box. And then add in one color, add capital letters, and with another, add the punctuation marks. Madeleine can't hear me.
Okay.
So write the task here. You have no, it's in the next.
We don't have it here.
So let's write it here. Add can't use different colors, so use the same color. But in the classroom, when you do it with your students, you can ask them to do it with different colors. Okay, submitted their punctuation. Please complete the task. We want to move on.
And when you finish, just submit the form by clicking on the submit button.
the original poem with the capital letters that the poet used and the punctuation marks. Can you move it on? Yes, here it is. This is an activity that you can do with any text, not only with poetry. It's good to do it when you teach poetry because you draw the attention of the students to the visual aspect, but you can do it with any text. I usually like to do that at the beginning of the school year so that we all agree when we need to write capital letters, how to use punctuation marks. You need to remind your students, however, that in poetry, every line begins with a capital letter, unlike other texts, right? So as you can see here, all the lines begin with capital letters. We have quotation marks, we have commas and full stops, which make everything very clear for the reader. And it is a good activity that you can all try and use with your students, as I said, but still we don't have a title. So please now try to think about a title and then write it in Linoit, right? Can you move it to the next? I hope you change it. Yes, you create your own title now.
In your notebooks.
Yes, you write it in your notebooks first. Do you understand what you need to do? I'll write it here maybe, yes. So put the poem so that they will see it. Show them the poem. Yes. Is there someone who doesn't understand the task? If you don't understand, raise your hands. Task. Okay, Tali, what you need to do is write a title for this poem. Read it carefully and write a title. Can you hear me? If not, send the instructions again. Okay. In front of you. Carol, you need to give a title to the poem that begins with "said the little boy," the one you capitalized.
Right here, the link, okay, to the answer garden. We've used it before. So please, please go to this new link and write your title in the answer garden. Okay, up to 40 characters. In the chat box. Please raise your hand.
Press the link in the chat box if you can open it from there.
And if you still can, just write it in the chat and I will post it for you.
What we can use in order to encourage the students to think about the poem that they read is to ask them to write a title. We've used it before when we had short stories and we talked about headlines, newspaper kind of headlines. But it's not the same. When you ask students to write a headline, you're asking them to identify the main ideas and then think about a catchy way to write it. And as we said many times before, and this is an important thing that I want you to remember, is that we are trying to make the students' thinking visible. I've said it before. We don't have access to other people's thinking, nor do we have access to our own thinking processes. So we want to encourage the students to make the thinking visible by asking them either to use graphic organizers or to write headlines and put it on the wall, or here, in the case of poetry, to write a title. Now, a title of a poem is different from headline. Headline appeals to our mind. It demands some kind of cognitive work on behalf of the viewer. When we write titles for poems, we ask the students to do something that is similar to the things that the poet is doing when he writes poetry. And you will see in poetry that poems, the titles in poems are different. It's either the beginning, the first line of the poem, or a one word or a metaphor, or sometimes we don't have a title at all, but it always evokes some emotive response for the reader. So when we ask students to write titles for poems, we need to encourage them to do it in a way that will do something to the viewer, which is different. For instance, I can ask you now to read your title again and try to think what kind of color or colors you would like to use when you write this title. Write it in your notebooks. We cannot do it here, but you can do it in your notebook. Just write to yourself which color or colors you would use for each word in your title. Write it and you'll feel and understand what I mean when we ask the students to use some visual representations like colors, maybe the background or a picture that they would like to add. So write it to yourself. What would you do? What would you do in your title before you put it on the wall? Which colors would you use? Or what kind of background would you use? Is there someone who doesn't understand what you need to do? If you don't understand, raise your hand. Iman. What I'd like you to do now is to read again your title, the one that you submitted, and decide which colors or colors or shades of color you would use if you had to put it on the wall and you had the opportunity to use colors. Let's move on to the next poem. This is the poem, the original title, by the way, and this is the name of the poet. It's Shel Silverstein, and all the poems that we will read today are Shel Silverstein's poems. You probably know his book, The Giving Tree. He wrote many poems, and they are very simple. They look very simple, but there is so much that you can do with them, and you will see what I mean in the course of this session today. So this is the title that he gave the poem, The Little Boy and the Man. Okay? All right, so let's move on to the next poem. Okay, the voice. There is a voice inside of you that whispers all day long. I feel that this is right for me. I know that this is wrong. No tea, chirpy, chirper, friend, or wise men can decide what's right for you. Just listen to the voice that speaks inside. So this is the poem, The Voice, again by Shel Silverstein. And what you need to do now is to read it again and write down in your notebooks what the main idea of this poem is. Up to 15 words, not more. You need to write it in your notebooks, okay? Can you see the instructions, Sasha, and those who can't hear me? Write the main idea of the poem in your notebook. Your main idea, please raise your hand.
hand.
They're right.
Okay, and please don't write it in the chat. Okay, just on your notebooks. In your notebooks.
In words, not more. Make a small poll and ask who agrees with the main idea that he wrote. If you agree with the main idea, write, where is it in the poll? Write, press on A. If you don't agree with this main idea, press B. So I repeat, maybe we should write it here for those who can't hear me. If you agree with the main idea that you identified, press A. If you disagree, press B. And I saw that you raised your hand. Ilana, can you hear me? If you have a question, you can say it, write it in the chat box. Ilana, if you don't understand, if you don't agree with the main idea, press B.
Wait, don't you agree, or it's just that you don't have a question? What did you mean?
Okay. So only Ilana?
Okay, so the poll is now closed.
Most of the participants agreed with the main idea. Only how many?
9 agreed.
9 agreed and only 1 disagreed. And this idea of making polls in the classroom is very good. It makes all the students participate and then helps them see what people think. And what we want you to do now is to write an argument in your notebooks. Don't write it in the chat box. In your notebook, write an argument, again, up to 15 words, which explains why you agree or why you disagree, if you disagree with this main idea. So write an argument which explains why you think this is right or why you think it's not right and you disagree. Okay? Finish writing an argument. Raise your hand. When you write an argument, your argument needs to explain why this is true, why this main idea that you identify is true. You need to give an explanation, a justification, why you think it's true or why you think it's not true, if you disagree.
please raise your hand. Okay, this is the best sign for us that you're all done.
To the next task, and this time, if you wrote that you agree, now write I don't agree and give justification why you don't agree. If you wrote that you don't agree, write now I agree and justify your answer, why you agree. So what we are asking you to do is to write a counter argument. Again, in your notebook and in about 15 words, not more. If it's not clear, raise your hand and ask your questions. And maybe you should write the instruction here, write a counter argument. We need to know that you've completed the task. activity that we have had so now is something that you can do with any text, especially if it's controversial. You ask the students to identify the main idea, then you make a poll and see who agrees and who disagrees, and you ask them to write an argument which justifies their decision. Then you ask them to write a counter argument. And I know that some students are at the beginning reluctant and they don't want to do it. They say, why should I write it? I don't agree if I do agree, and vice versa. So we want to teach them that if we want them to be deep thinkers, they need to be able to think, to examine things from different perspectives. And that's what we're trying to do now. And we asked you to write counter arguments. So this is something that, as I said, you can do with any text. But this is not what poetry is about. This is not what we want to do when we teach poetry. When we teach poetry, we want to see how the poets... Bayan raised her hand. Okay. Bayan, do you have a question? No, okay. When we teach poetry, we want to see how the poet makes us feel, how he touches our inner feelings, how he evokes some kind of emotional responses. And for that, we need to examine the literary devices that he uses. So please read this poem again and write in the chat box to save time. We usually don't want the students to write the answers so that everybody can see and be influenced by the answers. But because our time is very short, I'm going to ask you just to write down if you see literary devices that the poet uses in this particular poem to make us feel something. So write it down in the chat box, please. So students are not used to doing, and we need to help them. So we ask questions. As I asked you now, I asked you what kind of literary devices you identify. As Yam wrote that he uses personification, it's true. The voice, this voice inside, which is something very vague, speaks and says, I feel that this is right for me, I know that this is wrong. Shua said correctly, Tali said rhymes, and Shua said repetition of the word voice. Very good. These are other literary devices that the poet uses. And again, we want to guide the students and see how these literary devices work. So let's examine the repetition. It's not only the repetition of voice. We have voice inside in the first line and a voice that speaks inside in the last line. So he makes some changes, and we need to draw the students' attention to the changes, because here in the last line he added speaks, right? And we also want to relate to the rhymes, and inside the last word in the poem, and the last word in the poem is usually very important. It's like the last note in music. So inside rhymes, we decide. And what does the poet do when he makes this repetition of voice inside and voice that speaks inside and couples it with decide? What is happening here? What do we learn from this? What is happening to us when we are exposed to these repetitions and rhyming? As our time is very short, we won't have time to discuss it, but I can just tell you that whenever there is repetition, we need to draw the students' attention to the repetition and understand that the poet is doing it to convey a message. Here, what he's doing is telling us that this voice is not just there, like in the opening, there is a voice. It's something that is active. It speaks. There is some speaking, some inner debate, some inner negotiation, and it is coupled with, inside is coupled with decide. When there are rhymes, we need to encourage the students to see if there is any connection between the two rhymes. Not always do we find connection, but in this case, he is telling us something very important. He's telling us that the poem is not about arbitrary gut feeling or intuition. It's something that involves some action, speaking, making a decision. So that's how we teach the students to be more sensitive to the use of words. And as I said, if they don't get it in the first reading, we need to train them and ask them questions and lead them to these conclusions. By the way, you're all familiar with the poem, The Road Not Taken. We have the same thing there when the poet in the first line says, 2 roads diverge in a yellow wood. And then in the last line, in the last stanza, he says, 2 roads diverge in a wood. It's not yellow anymore. It's not morning anymore, but he adds an I. And this I is what made all the difference. My decisions, what I did when I had to choose between the 2 roads. So it's the same technique, and we need to draw the students' attention to the use of rhymes, to ask them always if there is any connection between the 2 words that rhyme. Not always do we find a connection, but if we do, like in this case, it's very clear that the poet wanted to tell us that decide is very important, that it's not an intuition. It involves making a decision, considering, weighing, debating, and then making a thoughtful decision. So this is an example of the use of words to convey a meaning. And let's move on to the next poem. And we'll do it very quickly because our time is very short. Again, you have a short poem, and you need to complete it, to add the last line. Underneath my outside face, there is a face that none can see. A little less smiling, a little less sure. You need to complete it. Write the last sentence in your notebook, please. or maybe after you wrote it, read it aloud to yourself. You know that poetry is meant to be read aloud. So read it aloud to yourselves and see whether you are pleased with the sound. If not, change it and make it more appealing. And then when you're done, try to circle in your last line, the line that you completed, the word which is the most important word in your last line, the word that stands out. So we need to make progress, but I hope that you have found and you have circled the word that stands out. As you can see, this activity where you need to complete the last line is something that we did with short stories, but of course you can see that in poetry it's different. We need to make sure that the sound also works well and that it makes us feel something and create some kind of a mood for the poem. I wanted to ask you to see if there is a connection between the word that stood out in your last line and one word from the first 4 lines. As our time is very short, you will try it later on because we can't do it now, but I want to show you the original poem, which is called Under Face. And we won't do the task, we don't have time to do that, so read the complete poem. So it says, underneath my outside face, there is a face that none can see. A little less smiley, a little less sure, but a whole lot more like me. And if I asked you which word in the last line is the most important one, what would you say? Write it in the chat box. Okay? It's Bayan said me, yes, it's me. Now let's examine the first 4 words. What does it rhyme with? That's me. What does it rhyme with? Yes, Carol and Lila also wrote me. Yes, it rhymes with C. So as you can see again with the rhyming, we get everything. We understand that poem deals with appearance and reality, with what people see and with the real me. So again, you can help the students see the connection between the rhymes, and you can always draw their attention to the last line and to the last word in the poem. I'm sorry that we're doing it very fast because our time is short, but I hope you got the idea. We want to show you the last activity. We won't do it here because our time is short, and we promised you to see the rubrics. There is another poem which is called What If, and you can try it at home and try to decide what kind of activity you would use in order to encourage the students to think more deeply about the poem, about what it has in it, and also to use the ideas that we introduced here today about poetry and see how we can combine these 2 things and have a nice task for our students. So this is something that you'll have to do on your own. We don't have time. We want, as we promised, to show you the rubrics that your coordinators will use when they come to observe your lessons. So read them, and if you have a question about these rubrics, there are 7 categories. Yeah, but they cannot read they cannot read the whole thing together. So read the first 3, and if you have a question about these first 3 criteria, raise your hand. or write your question in the box. Any questions? If not, we will move on. As you see, we talked here about the structure of the lesson, organization. When we begin with individual tasks, the first task with a thought-provoking element, a good question that motivates the students and encourages them to work individually and think about the task. Then there is sharing time, organization by the teacher, and to give time for reflection. And we want to work with the entire class. When we do think per share or other sharing activities, all the students can participate, and that's what we want them to do. Let's move on.
Oshrat, it's up to 25 points. You choose, your coordinator will choose one for each rubric, okay?
So if it's very good, they'll choose 10 points for the first two and 5 for the third one. Okay? Okay, let's move on to the next rubric. Okay, so here you have another 5 criteria. Read them, and if you have questions, raise your hands or write your questions. Okay, so the last page, delaying judgment and not taking. Now, this is something that, if it is not clear, ask your questions, write your questions in the chat box, and we will do our best to explain.
And in any case, when I send you the recording of this lesson, I will also send you this document of the rubrics.
We understand that there are no questions. If you still have questions tomorrow or next, once you get the rubrics and when you get the recording, you can write to us and ask your questions, and we will try to answer. I hope you enjoyed this session, and I hope you enjoyed the whole in-service course. It was a pleasure for us.
Yes, indeed.
So thank you and good evening.
Goodbye.